On a quiet Wednesday afternoon in March of 2026, two women went hiking at their favorite trail in southern Utah, a place they've been coming to for years, a place they loved. They never came home. And the reason they died, the chain of events that put a killer in that parking lot on that specific afternoon, began 5 days earlier when a 22-year-old man from Iowa hit an elk on a dark highway and his truck was destroyed. His name was Ivan Miller, and he needed a car. Margaret Oldroyd was 86 years old, and she had lived in Lyman, Utah, for most of her life. Lyman is the kind of town where everyone knows your name, a tiny farming community in Wayne County, surrounded by wide-open fields and Red Rock Canyon walls. Margaret worked at Royals Market, the local grocery store over in Loa, and she was the kind of woman who showed up for people. She brought meals to sick neighbors. She remembered birthdays. She was strong in her faith. The mayor of Lyman, Burke Torgerson, would later say that he didn't think there was a single person in town who hadn't been touched by her kindness. Margaret lived alone in a house along the main road entering Lyman, and most evenings she could be found in her living room watching television. And so about 15 miles from Margaret's home, the Coxcomb Trail wound through some of the most spectacular scenery in all of Utah. Sandstone ridges rising from the desert floor like the spine of some ancient creature, with Capitol Reef's red cliffs glowing in the distance. It was one of the favorite hiking spots for Linda Dewey, 65, and her niece Natalie Graves, 34, who had been coming out to this stretch of Wayne County for years. Linda was the heart of her family, a wife, a mother, a grandmother, someone her relatives described as the person who held everyone together. Natalie had grown up in Salt Lake City and started dancing when she was 5 years old. She'd gone on to earn a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Modern Dance from the University of Utah, followed by an MBA. And it was at the university that she'd met her husband, Taylor Graves. They'd been inseparable for 16 years. The two of them had eventually moved to East Hampton, Massachusetts, where they'd immersed themselves in a creative, artistic community. But Natalie still came back to Utah to visit family, and when she did, she and her Aunt Linda would go hiking. They called it bonding over the beauty of the landscape. And on March 4th, 2026, that's exactly what they planned to do. Drive out to the Coxcomb Trailhead, park the white Subaru Outback, and spend an afternoon in the place they loved most. They had no way of knowing that a stranger was already waiting in that parking lot. And the reason he was there, the bizarre, terrible chain of events that delivered him to that exact spot, had begun 5 days earlier on a stretch of highway just 30 miles to the east. On Saturday night, February 28, 2026, Ivan Miller was driving west on Highway 24 through rural Wayne County when his truck collided with an elk. The impact destroyed the vehicle. Miller was 22 years old, from Blakesburg, Iowa, a small town in the southeast corner of the state, and he was far from home with no money and no plan. An auto parts store owner got a call around 10:30 that night to pick up the wrecked truck, and he towed Miller to the Smuggle Inn, a small motel in Loa. But Miller's troubles went beyond a broken-down truck. Mecca, Iowa, he had 4 pending criminal charges from December 2025, burglary, theft, marijuana possession, and a weapons charge. He was a man with nothing waiting for him and no way to get back to it. And so Miller stayed at the motel for a few days, and during that time something shifted. He made his way to Lyman, about 15 miles south. And on the night before the murders, he slept in Margaret Oldroyd's shed, the shed behind the home of an 86-year-old woman he had never met, in a town he had no connection to, in a state he'd only ended up in because of a dead elk on a dark road. The next morning, March 4th, Miller watched Margaret leave her house and drive away in her tan Buick LeSabre. And while she was gone, he walked through her front door and positioned himself behind it. And then he waited for her to come home. What happened next would set off the most violent 24 hours Wayne County had ever seen. When Margaret Oldroyd returned home that morning and sat down in her living room to watch television, Ivan Miller stepped out from behind the door, raised a .45 caliber 1911 pistol, and shot her in the back of the head. She never saw him. She likely never heard him. One moment she was watching TV in the home she lived in for decades, and the next she was gone. But that wasn't even the worst part, because Miller didn't stop there. He took Margaret's Buick and drove away, but according to his own confession, he didn't like the car. He wanted something newer, something that could get him back to Iowa. And so he drove to the Coxcomb trailhead, the same trail that Linda Dewey and Natalie Graves loved, and he parked in the lot and waited. And this is where the story takes its most horrifying turn, because sometime that afternoon, Linda and Natalie pulled into the parking lot in their white Subaru Outback. They got out of the car. There were two women about to go on a hike in one of the most beautiful places in the American West, and a stranger walked up to them. Miller shot Natalie first, one round at the chest. She went down. Then he turned to Linda and shot her twice in the body. But Linda was still moving, still alive, and so Miller pulled a large kitchen knife and stabbed her multiple times in the heart. He then dragged both bodies away from the parking lot, took the keys to the white Subaru, stole the women's credit cards, and drove away. Therefore, Ustasnajam. By the middle of the afternoon on March 4th, 3 women were dead, an 86-year-old grandmother shot in her living room, and an aunt and niece killed on a hiking trail, all so that a 22-year-old drifter could steal their cars and the handful of cash on their credit cards. At 4:25 that afternoon, the husbands of Linda and Natalie arrived at the trailhead to find their wives. What they found instead would shatter their lives. But one of the husbands had a key fob tracking app on his phone, connected to Subaru, and when he checked it, the car's location appeared, moving south away from the trail, headed toward the state line. And so within hours, a multi-state manhunt was underway. Investigators traced the Subaru through license plate cameras across southern Utah, into northern Arizona, and eventually into Colorado. By 9 o'clock that Wednesday night, the key fob signal appeared in Farmington, New Mexico, roughly 2 hours from where Miller would ultimately be caught. The stolen Subaru was found abandoned in Pagosa Springs, Colorado, and at 2:45 in the morning on March 5th, local police spotted Miller on foot. He was carrying a .45 caliber handgun and a large kitchen knife. The knife still had blood on it. When investigators sat Ivan Miller down and asked him what happened, he didn't deny it. He told them he'd killed 3 women because he needed money, and he needed a car to get back to Iowa. He said the killings had to be done, but he also said he didn't like doing it. And when they asked him about the knife, the one he'd used to stab Linda Dewey on the Coxcomb Trail, he didn't point to a location or describe where he'd left it. He simply reached down and pulled it out. He'd been carrying it the entire time. A kitchen knife with a dead woman's blood still visible on the blade, tucked into a holster on his body like it was nothing. What Linda Dewey experienced in her final moments was a nightmare no one should have to imagine. She was 65 years old, standing in a parking lot in one of the most beautiful landscapes on earth, watching her 34-year-old niece collapse from a gunshot wound. And then the gun turned on her. She was shot twice, and when that wasn't enough, a stranger knelt over her with a knife. The last thing she would have seen was red rock and blue sky. The same canyon walls she and Natalie had come to love. The same trail they'd hiked a dozen times before. Natalie Graves, 34, had started dancing when she was 5. She had earned 2 degrees. She had been with the love of her life for 16 years. She was killed in a parking lot by a man who wanted her car. Ivan Miller was charged with 3 counts of first-degree aggravated murder. In the days that followed, the community of Lyman did what small towns do. They grieved together. A woman who lived near Margaret Oldroyd tied pink ribbons around town to honor her neighbor. And the mayor spoke publicly about the kind of person Margaret had been, how she had touched every life in that little farming community. At a vigil in Wayne County, residents from across the area gathered to remember all 3 women, Margaret, Linda, and Natalie, as one community mourning together. Taylor Graves, Natalie's husband, the man she'd met at the University of Utah and had been inseparable from for 16 years, now faced a life without her. Linda's family, who had called her the heart of everything they were, now had a hole that nothing could fill. And the husbands who had driven out to that trailhead, expecting to pick up their wives from a hike, instead became the ones who found the bodies and triggered the manhunt that caught the man who killed them. Ivan Miller, 22 years old, sits in a Utah jail awaiting trial on 3 counts of aggravated murder. If convicted, he faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. The entire chain of events, 3 women dead, families destroyed, a community shattered, began because a truck hit an elk on Highway 24, and a young man with nothing to lose decided that other people's lives were worth less than a ride home. He still had the blood on the knife when they caught him.